Complete works of Swami Vivekananda. Volume 1. Lectures and Discourses. Vedic Religious Ideals. What concerns us most is the religious thought, on soul and God and all that appertains to religion. We will take the Samhitâs. These are collections of hymns forming, as it were, the oldest Aryan literature, properly speaking, the oldest literature in the world. There may have been some scraps of literature of older date here and there, older than that even, but not books, or literature properly so called. As a collected book, this is the oldest the world has, and herein is portrayed the earliest feeling of the Aryans, their aspirations, the questions that arose about their manners and methods, and so on. At the very outset we find a very curious idea. These hymns are sung in praise of different gods, Devas as they are called, the bright ones. There is quite a number of them. One is called Indra, another Varuna, another Mitra, Parjanya, and so on. Various mythological and allegorical figures come before us one after the other, for instance, Indra the thunderer, striking the serpent who has withheld the rains from mankind. Then he lets fly his thunderbolt, the serpent is killed, and rain comes down in showers. The people are pleased, and they worship Indra with oblations. They make a sacrificial pyre, kill some animals, roast their flesh upon spits, and offer that meat to Indra. And they had a popular plant called soma. What plant it was nobody knows now, it has entirely disappeared, but from the books we gather that, when crushed, it produced a sort of milky juice, and that was fermented, and it can also be gathered that this fermented soma juice was intoxicating. This also they offered to Indra and the other gods, and they also drank it themselves. Sometimes they drank a little too much, and so did the gods. Indra on occasions got drunk. There are passages to show that Indra at one time drank so much of this soma juice that he talked irrelevant words. So with Varuna. He is another god, very powerful, and is in the same way protecting his votaries, and they are praising him with their libations of soma. So is the god of war, and so on. But the popular idea that strikes one as making the mythologies of the Samhitâs entirely different from the other mythologies is, that along with every one of these gods is the idea of an infinity. This infinite is abstracted, and sometimes described as aditya. At other times it is affixed, as it were, to all the other gods. Take, for example, Indra. In some of the books you will find that Indra has a body, is very strong, sometimes is wearing golden armor, and comes down, lives and eats with his votaries, fights the demons, fights the snakes, and so on. Again, in one hymn we find that Indra has been given a very high position. He is omnipresent and omnipotent, and Indra sees the heart of every being. So with Varuna. This Varuna is god of the air and is in charge of the water, just as Indra was previously, and then, all of a sudden, we find him raised up and said to be omnipresent, omnipotent, and so on. I will read one passage about this Varuna in his highest form, and you will understand what I mean. It has been translated into English poetry, so it is better that I read it in that form. The mighty Lord on high our deeds, as if at hand, espies. The gods know all men do, though men would fain their acts disguise. Whoever stands, whoever moves, or steals from place to place, or hides him in his secret cell, the gods his movements trace. Wherever two together plot, and deem they are alone, King Varuna is there, a third, and all their schemes are known. This earth is his, to him belong those vast and boundless skies. Both seas within him rest, and yet in that small pool he lies. Whoever far beyond the sky should think his way to wing, he could not there elude the grasp of Varuna the king. His spies, descending from the skies, glide all this world around. their thousand eyes all scanning sweep to Earth's remotest bound. So we can multiply examples about the other gods. They all come, one after the other, to share the same fate. They first begin as gods, and then they are raised to this conception as the being in whom the whole universe exists, who sees every heart, who is the ruler of the universe. And in the case of Varuna, there is another idea, just the germ of one idea which came, but was immediately suppressed by the Aryan mind, and that was the idea of fear. In another place we read they are afraid they have sinned and ask Varuna for pardon. These ideas were never allowed, for reasons you will come to understand later on, to grow on Indian soil, but the germs were the sprouting, the idea of fear, and the idea of sin. This is the idea, as you all that know, of what is called monotheism. This monotheism, we see, came to India at a very early period. Throughout the Samhitâs, in the first and oldest part, this monotheistic idea prevails, but we shall find that it did not prove sufficient for the Aryans. They threw it aside, as it were, as a very primitive sort of idea and went further on, as we Hindus think. Of course, in reading books and criticisms on the Vedas written by Europeans, the Hindu cannot help smiling when he reads that the writings of our authors are saturated with this previous education alone. Persons who have sucked in as their mother's milk the idea that the highest ideal of God is the idea of a personal God, naturally dare not think on the lines of these ancient thinkers of India, when they find that just after the Samhitâs, the monotheistic idea with which the Samhita portion is replete was thought by the Aryans to be useless and not worthy of philosophers and thinkers, and that they struggled hard for a more philosophical and transcendental idea. The monotheistic idea was much too human for them, although they gave it such descriptions as the whole universe rests in him, and thou art the keeper of all hearts. The Hindus were bold, to their great credit be it said, bold thinkers in all their ideas, so bold that one spark of their thought frightens the so-called bold thinkers of the West. Well has it been said by Professor Max Muller about these thinkers that they climbed up to heights where their lungs only could breathe, and where those of other beings would have burst. These brave people followed reason wherever it led them, no matter at what cost, never caring if all their best superstitions were smashed to pieces, never caring what society would think about them, or talk about them, but what they thought was right and true. They preached and they talked. Before going into all these speculations of the ancient Vedic sages, we will first refer to one or two very curious instances in the Vedas. The peculiar fact that these gods are taken up, as it were, one after the other, raised and sublimated, till each has assumed the proportions of the infinite personal God of the universe, calls for an explanation. Professor Max Muller creates for it a new name, as he thinks it peculiar to the Hindus. He calls it enotheism. We need not go far for the explanation. It is within the book. A few steps from the very place where we find those gods being raised and sublimated, we find the explanation also. The question arises how the Hindu mythologies should be so unique, so different from all others. In Babylonian or Greek mythologies we find one god struggling upwards, and he assumes a position and remains there, while the other gods die out. Of all the Molochs, Jehovah becomes supreme, and the other Molochs are forgotten, lost forever. He is the god of gods. So, too, of all the Greek gods, Zeus comes to the front and assumes big proportions, becomes the god of the universe, and all the other gods become degraded into minor angels. This fact was repeated in later times. The Buddhists and the Jains raised one of their prophets to the godhead, and all the other gods they made subservient to Buddha, or to Jina. This is the worldwide process, but we find an exception, as it were. One god is praised, and for the time being it is said that all the other gods obey his commands, and the very one who is said to be raised up by Varuna, is himself raised up, in the next book, to the highest position. They occupied the position of the personal God in turns. But the explanation is there in the book, and it is a grand explanation, one that has given the theme to all subsequent thought in India, and one that will be the theme of the whole world of religions. Ekam sat viprabhayuda vadanti. That which exists is one, sages call it by various names. In all these cases where hymns were written about all these gods, the being perceived was one and the same. It was the perceiver who made the difference. It was the hymnist, the sage, the poet, who sang in different languages and different words, the praise of one and the same being. That which exists is one, sages call it by various names. Tremendous results have followed from that one verse. Some of you, perhaps, are surprised to think that India is the only country where there never has been a religious persecution, where never was any man disturbed for his religious faith. Theists or atheists, monists, dualists, monotheists are there and always live unmolested. Materialists were allowed to preach from the steps of Brahminical temples, against the gods, and against God himself. They went preaching all over the land that the idea of God was a mere superstition, and that gods, and Vedas, and religion were simply superstitions invented by the priests for their own benefit, and they were allowed to do this unmolested. And so, wherever he went, Buddha tried to pull down every old thing sacred to the Hindus to the dust, and Buddha died of ripe old age. So did the Jains, who laughed at the idea of God. How can it be that there is a God? They asked. It must be a mere superstition. So on, endless examples there are. Before the Mohammedan wave came into India, it was never known what religious persecution was. The Hindus had only experienced it as made by foreigners on themselves. And even now it is a patent fact how much Hindus have helped to build Christian churches, and how much readiness there is to help them. There never has been bloodshed. Even heterodox religions that have come out of India have been likewise affected. For instance, Buddhism. Buddhism is a great religion in some respects, but to confuse Buddhism with Vedanta is without meaning. Anyone may mark just the difference that exists between Christianity and the Salvation Army. There are great and good points in Buddhism, but these great points fell into hands which were not able to keep them safe. The jewels which came from philosophers fell into the hands of mobs, and the mobs took up their ideas. They had a great deal of enthusiasm, some marvelous ideas, great and humanitarian ideas, but, after all, there is something else that is necessary, thought and intellect, to keep everything safe. Wherever you see the most humanitarian ideas fall into the hands of the multitude, the first result, you may notice, is degradation. It is learning and intellect that keep things sure. Now this Buddhism went as the first missionary religion to the world, penetrated the whole of the civilized world as it existed at that time, and never was a drop of bloodshed for that religion. We read how in China the Buddhist missionaries were persecuted, and thousands were massacred by 2 or 3 successive emperors, but after that, fortune favored the Buddhists, and one of the emperors offered to take vengeance on the persecutors, but the missionaries refused. All that we owe to this one verse. That is why I want you to remember it, whom they call Indra, Mitra, Varuna. That which exists is one, sages call it by various names. It was written, nobody knows at what date, it may be 8,000 years ago. In spite of all modern scholars may say, it may be 9,000 years ago. Not one of these religious speculations is of modern date, but they are as fresh today as they were when they were written, or rather, fresher, for at that distant date man was not so civilized as we know him now. He had not learned to cut his brother's throat because he differed a little in thought from himself. He had not deluged the world in blood, he did not become demon to his own brother. In the name of humanity he did not massacre whole lots of mankind then. Therefore these words come to us today very fresh, as great stimulating, life-giving words, much fresher than they were when they were written. That which exists is one, sages call it by various names. We have to learn yet that all religions, under whatever name they may be called, either Hindu, Buddhist, Mohammedan, or Christian, have the same God, and he who derides any one of these derides his own God. That was the solution they arrived at. But, as I have said, this ancient monotheistic idea did not satisfy the Hindu mind. It did not go far enough. It did not explain the visible world. A ruler of the world does not explain the world, certainly not. A ruler of the universe does not explain the universe, and much less an external ruler, one outside of it. He may be a moral guide, the greatest power in the universe, but that is no explanation of the universe, and the first question that we find now arising, assuming proportions, is the question about the universe. Whence did it come? How did it come? How does it exist? Various hymns are to be found on this question struggling forward to assume form, and nowhere do we find it so poetically, so wonderfully expressed as in the following hymn. Then there was neither aught nor naught, nor air, nor sky, nor anything. What covered all? Where rested all? Then death was not, nor deathlessness, nor change to night and day. The translation loses a good deal of the poetical beauty. Then death was not, nor deathlessness, nor change to night and day. The very sound of the Sanskrit is musical. That existed, that breath, covering as it were, that God's existence, but it did not begin to move. It is good to remember this one idea that it existed motionless, because we shall find how this idea sprouts up afterwards in the cosmology, how according to the Hindu metaphysics and philosophy, this whole universe is a mass of vibrations, as it were, motions, and there are periods when this whole mass of motions subsides and becomes finer and finer, remaining in that state for some time. That is the state described in this hymn. It existed unmoved, without vibration, and when this creation began, this began to vibrate and all this creation came out of it, that one breath, calm, self-sustained, naught else beyond it. Gloom existed first. Those of you who have ever been in India or any tropical country, and have seen the bursting of the monsoon, will understand the majesty of these words. I remember three poets' attempts to picture this. Milton says, no light, but rather darkness visible. Kalidasa says, darkness which can be penetrated with a needle, but none comes near this Vedic description, gloom hidden in gloom. Everything is parching and sizzling, the whole creation seems to be burning away, and for days it has been so, when one afternoon there is in one corner of the horizon a speck of cloud, and in less than half an hour it has extended unto the whole earth, until, as it were, it is covered with cloud, cloud over cloud, and then it bursts into a tremendous deluge of rain. The cause of creation was described as will. That which existed at first became changed into will, and this will began to manifest itself as desire. This also we ought to remember, because we find that this idea of desire is said to be the cause of all we have. This idea of will has been the cornerstone of both the Buddhist and the Vedantic system, and later on, has penetrated into German philosophy and forms the basis of Schopenhauer's system of philosophy. It is here we first hear of it. Now first arose desire, the primal seed of mind. Sages, searching in their hearts by wisdom, found the bond between existence and non-existence. It is a very peculiar expression. The poet ends by saying that perhaps he even does not know. We find in this hymn, apart from its poetical merits, that this questioning about the universe has assumed quite definite proportions, and that the minds of these sages must have advanced to such a state, when all sorts of common answers would not satisfy them. we find that they were not even satisfied with this governor above. There are various other hymns where the same idea comes in, about how this all came, and just as we have seen, when they were trying to find a governor of the universe, a personal god, they were taking up one Deva after another, raising him up to that position. So now we shall find that in various hymns one or other idea is taken up, and expanded infinitely and made responsible for everything in the universe. One particular idea is taken as the support, in which everything rests and exists, and that support has become all this. So on with various ideas. They tried this method with prana, the life principle. They expanded the idea of the life principle until it became universal and infinite. It is the life principle that is supporting everything, not only the human body, but it is the light of the sun and the moon. It is the power moving everything, the universal motive energy. Some of these attempts are very beautiful, very poetical. Some of them, as "He ushers the beautiful morning," are marvelously lyrical in the way they picture things. Then this very desire, which, as we have just read, arose as the first primal germ of creation, began to be stretched out, until it became the universal God. But none of these ideas satisfied. Here the idea is sublimated and finally abstracted into a personality. He alone existed in the beginning, he is the one Lord of all that exists, he supports this universe, he who is the author of souls, he who is the author of strength, whom all the gods worship, whose shadow is life, whose shadow is death, whom else shall we worship? Whose glory the snow-tops of the Himalayas declare, whose glory the oceans with all their waters proclaim. So on it goes, but, as I told you just now, this idea did not satisfy them. At last we find a very peculiar position. The Aryan mind had so long been seeking an answer to the question from outside. They questioned everything they could find, the sun, the moon, and stars, and they found all they could in this way. The whole of nature at best could teach them only of a personal being who is the ruler of the universe, it could teach nothing further. In short, out of the external world we can only get the idea of an architect, that which is called the design theory. It is not a very logical argument, as we all know, there is something childish about it, yet it is the only little bit of anything we can know about God from the external world, that this world required a builder. But this is no explanation of the universe. The materials of this world were before him, and this God wanted all these materials, and the worst objection is that he must be limited by the materials. The builder could not have made a house without the materials of which it is composed. Therefore he was limited by the materials, he could only do what the materials enabled him to. Therefore the God that the design theory gives is at best only an architect, and a limited architect of the universe. He is bound and restricted by the materials, he is not independent at all. That much they had found out already, and many other minds would have rested at that. In other countries the same thing happened. The human mind could not rest there, the thinking, grasping minds wanted to go further, but those that were backward got hold of them and did not allow them to grow. But fortunately these Hindu sages were not the people to be knocked on the head, they wanted to get a solution, and now we find that they were leaving the external for the internal. The first thing that struck them was, that it is not with the eyes and the senses that we perceive that external world, and know anything about religion. The first idea, therefore, was to find the deficiency, and that deficiency was both physical and moral, as we shall see. You do not know, says one of these sages, the cause of this universe. There has arisen a tremendous difference between you and me. Why? Because you have been talking sense things and are satisfied with sense objects and with the mere ceremonials of religion, while I have known the Purusha or beyond. Along with this progress of spiritual ideas that I am trying to trace for you, I can only hint to you a little about the other factor in the growth, for that has nothing to do with our subject. Therefore I need not enlarge upon it. The growth of rituals. As those spiritual ideas progressed in arithmetical progression, so the ritualistic ideas progressed in geometrical progression. The old superstitions had by this time developed into a tremendous mass of rituals, which grew and grew till it almost killed the Hindu life, and it is still there. It has got hold of and permeated every portion of our life and made us born slaves. Yet, at the same time, we find a fight against this advance of ritual from the very earliest days. The one objection raised there is this, that love for ceremonials, dressing at certain times, eating in a certain way, and shows and the mummeries of religion like these are only external religion, because you are satisfied with the senses and do not want to go beyond them. This is a tremendous difficulty with us, with every human being. At best, when we want to hear of spiritual things, our standard is the senses, or a man hears things about philosophy, and God, and transcendental things, and after hearing about them for days, he asks, after all, how much money will they bring? How much sense enjoyment will they bring? For his enjoyment is only in the senses, quite naturally. But that satisfaction in the senses, says our sage, is one of the causes which have spread the veil between truth and ourselves. Devotion to ceremonials, satisfaction in the senses, and forming various theories, have drawn a veil between ourselves and truth. This is another great landmark, and we shall have to trace this ideal to the end, and see how it developed later on into that wonderful theory of Maya of the Vedanta, how this veil will be the real explanation of the Vedanta. How the truth was there all the time, it was only this veil that had covered it. Thus we find that the minds of these ancient Aryan thinkers had begun a new theme. They found out that in the external world no search would give an answer to their question. They might seek in the external world for ages, but there would be no answer to their questions. So they fell back upon this other method, and according to this, they were taught that these desires of the senses, desires for ceremonials and externalities, have caused a veil to come between themselves and the truth, and that this cannot be removed by any ceremonial. They had to fall back on their own minds, and analyze the mind to find the truth in themselves. The outside world failed and they turned back upon the inside world, and then it became the real philosophy of the Vedanta. From here the Vedanta philosophy begins. It is the foundation stone of Vedanta philosophy. As we go on, we find that all its inquiries are inside. From the very outset they seem to declare, look not for the truth in any religion, it is here in the human soul, the miracle of all miracles in the human soul, the emporium of all knowledge, the mine of all existence, seek here. What is not here cannot be there. And they found out step by step that that which is external is but a dull reflection at best of that which is inside. We shall see how they took, as it were, this old idea of God, the governor of the universe, who is external to the universe, and first put him inside the universe. He is not a God outside, but he is inside, and they took him from there into their own hearts. Here he is in the heart of man, the soul of our souls, the reality in us. Several great ideas have to be understood, in order to grasp properly the workings of the Vedanta philosophy. In the first place, it is not philosophy in the sense we speak of the philosophy of Kant and Hegel. It is not one book, or the work of one man. Vedanta is the name of a series of books written at different times. Sometimes in one of these productions there will be 50 different things. Neither are they properly arranged. The thoughts, as it were, have been jotted down. Sometimes in the midst of other extraneous things, we find some wonderful idea. But one fact is remarkable, that these ideas in the Upanishads would be always progressing. In that crude old language, the working of the mind of every one of the sages has been, as it were, painted just as it went, how the ideas are at first very crude, and they become finer and finer till they reach the goal of the Vedanta, and this goal assumes a philosophical name. Just at first it was a search after the Devas, the bright ones, and then it was the origin of the universe, and the very same search is getting another name, more philosophical, clearer, the unity of all things, knowing which everything else becomes known.